Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to a conversation that's been sparked by Andrea Peña's work, BOGOTÁ, a visceral post-Baroque universe that explores transformation, resistance, and the politics of embodiment. Tonight's panel takes its cue from the work, but expands outwards to ask, how do bodies, spaces, and systems choreograph one another? What does it mean to move through imposed structures? And how can artistic practice open up spaces for agency, negotiation, and collective imagination? We're joined by some incredible practitioners who each bring different forms of movement thinking through choreography, architecture, and public art. But before we dive in, as Brody said, I'll invite each of them to introduce themselves in their own words, and then we'll begin.
Yeah, hello. I'm Andreas Lang. I have two hats on in my life, maybe three. I run a art and architecture design practice, which is called Public Works, which has worked quite immersively in this area for the last 20 years, and is really about participatory community empowerment, rights to the city movements. So we are now in Poplar, not too far, but really have seen the transformation and contributed in some way to the reflection on this transformation. I also teach an MA in architecture, which really steps out of this kind of practice, which is in Central St. Martin's, an art and design college. So the arts methodologies, design methodologies, and their conversation with architecture is really important to us and to me. So I'm really pleased to be here and to contribute. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Mariam Zulfiqar. I am the director of Artangel in London. Artangel is an organisation that has been going for many decades, working with artists. Our strapline is Extraordinary Art in Unexpected Places. We've presented works in a number of different locations across London, across the UK and internationally. Really what brings me to Artangel is I have always worked with artists in producing work for places beyond the museum and gallery, and I think that's sort of what brings me to this conversation as well, about how we work with sites that are not necessarily the conventional places where people expect to see the ideas of artists.
Hello, I'm Andrea Peña. I'm artistic director and choreographer of Andrea Peña and Artists. We are a company based out of Montreal in Canada, but like the work, I'm originally from Colombia, from Bogotá. And I also have a practice in design, so I have a master's as well in design and a bachelor's. So my work, my practice is really sort of trying to weave the universe of these two things together and find the conversation between design, space, materiality, and the body. And at the same time, I have indigenous ancestry that is Muisca. So Muisca are the people that are situated in the region of the Andes in Colombia. So a lot of those values and ways of thinking are things that are also quite central to the work and the way I make my work. Thank you.
Thank you all. I realised I didn't really introduce myself. I am a curator, I'm a cultural strategist and a gallerist, and I like to think of myself as a dancer at heart. You know, when you dance from the age of 6 up until, your teens, you never really let go of that. So anything dance just lights me up from the inside. So I'm still vibrating from the impact of seeing BOGOTÁ last night. Who saw BOGOTÁ last night? Right, so you know. Get your questions ready. We'll dive in. I want to start by riffing on the idea of choreography as social architecture and what it allows for agency, thinking about tools and power. So for you, Andrea, you spoke last night in the Q&A after the performance about building Bogotá from the bottom up and equipping everyone with tools before creating the piece, and I'm sure throughout the creation of the piece. What did this approach, this decentralized approach, open up for you as a choreographer? And what challenges did it pose?
Yeah, I think a lot of the things even sometimes when I refer to myself as a choreographer, I also sometimes refer to myself as a movement designer. I don't really know what that means, and sort of trying to think about the relationship of body and architecture, body and space, body and object, and trying to bring some of that into the work. When I did my master's, one of the big questions that I had was really looking at how our built environment choreographs our bodies. So the way we sit in chairs, the way we open a door, the way we get in a car, the way we cook our eggs. If we were to take all those objects away, those would be extremely choreographic movements. And so I became really fascinated with this idea of how sometimes, and especially industrial design, all of these chairs are designed to an average body, but all of us here in this room have completely different bodies, but yet we're all sort of situated in the same sort of environment and object. So through design, I became really interested in this idea of how the individual expresses itself within the environment, and that is something that later, or through my choreographic practice, kind of came into the work. In asking questions of what is the role of agency and negotiation inside of the choreographic practice? How do I, as a movement designer, design systems for people to interact with or systems for people to activate, rather than systems or ideas that are imposed to be replicated in a similar way how the environment asks us to always sit the same? So it was sort of these questions that were really born, I think, as a design thinker, that then found their way into the choreographic practice and started nurturing the space of agency, and how performers can activate spaces of agency, spaces of change, spaces that are undefined, spaces that are more fluid. That was sort of a very, very big part to how these things have been created, especially in that work.
And that came across really strongly throughout the performance. There was such a sense of individuality for each performer. There was no hierarchy amongst them. And that is the beauty of having an approach that is agency-oriented. So I want to open up to the other panelists in thinking about non-hierarchical approaches to your own practices that empower the audience or that empower communities. Can you reflect on how you approach that in your practice?
Well, yeah, it's pretty core to what we do. I think it happens on the level of the organization, that we're very horizontal and maybe understand ourselves as a commons-based organization where we share our resources, we negotiate how they're kind of used, and that kind of radiates out into the work, of course, that set of values. So when you were speaking in terms of agency, I feel for us it's really important how people understand and make use of the city and of the spaces that are around them. And this idea of the right to the city is very strong, that you enact your rights to be in the city in the way you feel reflects you and your culture. So how you enact these rights becomes how you gain access to land, how you gain access to shaping and thinking about that land becomes really crucial and important for us. And a lot of the work is around facilitation and listening and understanding who's in the room or who's in the space, who's got what needs, and how do you work with that. In teaching, it also reflects really on how you acknowledge the lived experience of the student, how you kind of give voice and develop that voice, how do you develop that agency. So it kind of, I would say agency cuts through all the layers.
As a core value?
I would say is that you test your agency, develop it, it's like a muscle. You rehearse.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what Andreas was just saying. I think when you work, we don't have a museum or a gallery that's our own space. So whenever we're working with artists and developing ideas, and this is true of every role I've ever had prior to this one at Artangel with forestry that Andreas knows knows well from the time I was there, and before that, when I was doing some stuff with places like Chiswick House, that's a historical site, or with Art on the Underground, when I was at the London Underground Art Programme for 5 years. When you're working in these spaces are not your own, you share them with lots of people, whether it's the custodians of those sites, or whether it's the people who maintain them, or whether it's the people that use them regularly. As the public in the London Underground, it was commuters. And so you're actually constantly negotiating with all the forces in any one given place. And I think that you need to find ways to collaborate with people and take them on the journey of your idea, because you need their help quite often. You know, like if I'm working in a historical site, or even now we've just opened a show in a disused office space in St James's Park. We have to collaborate with the people that own those buildings, and the negotiation part comes where you really understand the idea of the artist and what they're trying to do, but then you also understand the challenges and limitations of the people who you're trying to convince to work with you. And it's that sort of, it requires quite a lot of diplomacy and a lot of understanding. In the past, when I've been invited by places like Chiswick House to commission for them, one of the conversations I often have with these big structures is, you know, you've invited me to produce a artwork, but actually what you're going to get at the end of this, if I've been successful, is a new way of thinking what's possible within your own institution, not just an artwork. And my hope is always that I've built enough confidence for them in a commissioner curator so that someone can come after me and do another project. Because if I damage that by being too unsympathetic or unresponsive to their needs, they'll shut that process down, and I've closed a willingness from them to want to do something differently. And so I would say negotiation, listening to everybody, trying to understand what the artist is doing, but being really skilled in that diplomacy is key, otherwise we wouldn't be able to achieve the things that we do.
From these answers, it's clear that you all are very adept at this level of diplomacy. You've had to wield that in many different ways. So maybe as an offering for some people in the audience, are there any kind of rituals of how to hold space for people that you've developed that has enabled you to successfully collaborate, or, you know, and empower, you know, your stakeholders alongside making effective decisions, because you're still trying to get the thing done?
I always ask people, what are you worried about? Tell me what you're worried about. And then I say, will you help me to help you? Because then actually when people realize, oh, she actually genuinely cares that I've got this concern. Because I love, in a big bureaucratic organization, turning a no into a yes. But in order for me to turn that no into a yes, I need to understand what they're worried about that no. And once I understand that, and quite often I'll go back to the artist and say, you know, London Underground would be a really good example. I was there for 5 years. It's got the highest safety record of any public organisation in the world. That comes from the King's Cross fire. It comes from a very real moment when a tragedy happened. And so if we were trying to do something in a station, and I would say, tell me what you're worried about, if they would say, well, our concern is this, this, and this, those are legitimate concerns, and then I'd take them back to the artist to say, let's talk about this and let's meet them where they are. And that's how you, I believe, create really site-responsive work, not just site-specific work, but responsive to all of the anxieties and possibilities in any given site. And for me, that's what makes something feel like it really, truly is of that place.
A really sympathetic, attuned listening, a ritualistic listening for people's concerns. Did you want to?
Yeah, I was just actually, Andreas was talking about the idea of facilitation and to be a facilitator. And I think that's also something that is very sort of prone to design thinking, this idea of how does a designer show up not as a designer with the answers. You know, back in the day, the designer was sort of, I have the answers. And now or for many years, design has sort of shifted to being like, well, how can I be a facilitator of a solution and listen to the needs of whether that's a community, people. And I think that idea of facilitation for me is also very rooted in my practice, is as a choreographer, how do I not choreograph on people, but how do I facilitate ideas through creating a space? So I think it's really, for me, to be a facilitator in a space is sort of similar, to facilitate people's needs, to facilitate different points of view, to facilitate ways of thinking. It's not really a ritual, but it makes me think of this idea of pluriversality, which I really love. And pluriversality is, rather than trying to achieve universality, one universe that we all should belong to, this idea of pluriversality means how do multiple universes coexist. So I think what I'm trying to do in the work, and maybe those of you who saw the piece, it's very complex. We could almost call it chaotic at times, but it's also, for me, it's important on stage to reflect spaces of pluriversality with different points of view, different ways of engaging, choreographic tools that facilitate these different pluriverses existing in space. So,
now you got to tell me what one of these tools are. Bated breath. How do you facilitate that? Just give us one little insight.
Facilitate
the pluriversality.
We talk a lot in dance spaces. Usually, this is dance. We're used to talking through the body very often. But for me in the work, it's really important to make space for conversation. So a lot of the things in dance, but I think in architecture and everything, the notion of dramaturgy is really interesting. And you can have dramaturgy in terms of people's experience from the entrance in the door all the way up to the space. And one of the things we try to do is to decenter the dramaturgical practice from the dramaturge. So that means rather than having one person that is taking care of sort of the linear sense making of the work, we try to build tools for everybody on the team to have a dramaturgical understanding of the piece, so that everybody has the tools, the concepts, the ideas, the sense-making, the references, so that everybody can activate the work from an equal playing field. So it's almost like we choreograph a sort of collective understanding of the work first, through dialogue, through discussion, through museum visits, very simple things sometimes, through watching films, to equip everybody with these dramaturgical notions together so we can build a work from that point of view.
Fascinating. Did you have a response?
Tools. I echo with everything that's been said. I guess one thing that I notice a lot when community is not necessarily a happy place, people have opinions about each other, they complain. And I guess one thing I always try to instill in students is that if you have a complaint, also maybe don't just complain, also offer a solution. So put yourself into the problem in some way. Don't let it disempower you, but find a way to make yourself part of it and to offer a solution. And giving yourself that permission of thinking forward into that way is empowering. And I feel that's always it's a little tool which is quite helpful in giving permissions. And I feel a lot of the time the cultures that surround us are so much about compliance, specifically in architecture. You have to comply to so many things, comply to kind of idea of taste, comply to idea what your parents do, comply, whatever. So giving yourself permission seems quite an important moment of self-reflection. That's really helpful.
Thank you. And I want to turn to, it's really riffing off again what you just shared with us about pluriversality, a new word for me, in relationship to this idea of hybridity, which is so core to BOGOTÁ. It's a deeply hybrid work, shaped by diaspora, queerness, and ancestral connection. So I want to ask you, beyond pluriversality, what does hybridity really mean for you? And how does it show up choreographically or visually in the process?
I think, you know, today more than ever, we are so hybrid. I was just talking with Andreas, you know, I spend about 8 months a year on the road, away from home. And I've lived in many places since I was very young. And so I feel a sort of sponge of multiple things that I kind of carry with me. And I think many of us are very similar today in this sort of global world that we're in. And I think, like you were talking about constraint, or I don't remember the exact word, but I think making space for the undefined is really important, and the in-between. I literally have a tattoo that says the in-between. Just because I'm sort of fascinated with these spaces that are harder to define, things that are not yes or no, black or white, this or that. It's like, how do we sit in comfort in liminal spaces and undefined spaces and things that are not necessarily one emotion, but a sentiment that is like somehow more complex for us to understand. And so I think for me, these spaces of hybridity, fluidity are really important to be able to sit. How do we sit comfortably in sort of the gray zone of who we are as people, whether we're diasporic people, whether, you know, I grew up, my whole family's in Latin America, still in Colombia, but, you know, I've been away from there for a long time. So there's a sense of belonging and not belonging that I'm sort of, you know, navigating, and many of us are. And I think for me also, this question of hybridity obviously comes also to the notion of queerness. As a queer person, or my team is predominantly very queer, what does it mean to not necessarily define what queer is, but rather use queer as a verb? And so that's something we do a lot, is what does it mean to queer space? So what would it mean to, queer the relationship of body and object? What would it mean to queer how we think about the body? So thinking of queerness as a verb, something that gives us space for possibility, or a space to think about things slightly differently. There's a really amazing text by Saha Ahmed, and it's called Queer Phenomenology, and she's talking about the place of embodiment for queer bodies, and how what is the notion of embodiment or space in queerness, and how a lot of us queer communities were constantly creating spaces that are ephemeral, spaces that sort of build and unbuild, because we don't have spaces that are as affirmed or structured as non-queer folks. So how we're comfortable in these spaces that are evaporating constantly. So yeah, I'm fascinated in that sort of undefinedness.
I'm sure people who saw the show will have questions specifically about the forms you created and the approaches to movement that, for me, seem to reflect what you're talking about in terms of the queering of movement, because I don't know how you did it. I'll leave it for the audience to ask those questions. But for the other panelists, how do we make space for these intersectional identities without fixing them, without wanting to control, giving space for that liminality in our practices?
I think the beauty for me often, and the innovation or the generative moment sits in the relation between things, how we make sense of often contradicting things. So you are this, and you're also this, and you're this, and on paper it doesn't make sense, but we carry it and live it and embody it in ways. So I feel, again, I talk about students first, because for me that's kind of the kernel in which goes into practice. And for students, they look, and commissioners, they look for a single answer, solution. It's quite a solution-driven industry. So bringing complexity into this conversation, and nuance, and kind of allowing a contradiction to kind of be a driver in decision-making is quite important. I mean, that sounds very abstract, but it feels very real when you teach. It feels very real when you're in relation to a place and kind of try to hold kind of a conversation, or try to move something, change something. So allowing this contradiction not to shut things down, or these multiple identities not to shut things down, but to surface and to be generative. That sounds very abstract. It sounds very real in my head. So apologies.
No, it sounds really real to me as well, because I think, you know, if I think of the role that I have now at Artangel, when I speak to And in some ways, it's been something that's been developing in all the roles I've done at various different commissioning organisations, but I think it's really found a space where it can operate in the way that it does at this organisation specifically, is that sort of lack of prescription at the beginning, that when I'm starting a conversation with artists. So when I approach them, I never approach them with a brief or a timeline or a budget and say, can you answer this? Because that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking to build a relationship with them in which they get comfortable enough one day to ask me a question. And that question will start with, do you think it's possible to? And that's when I know that this feels something that's really organically developing as a result of trust and a recognition that their work's amazing and we want to work with them, but we don't necessarily want to prescribe to them what they should be making. And it takes long, the work we've just opened, it's been 3 years in the making, because that space needs to be created for an idea to be followed without restrictions being put on it. When you talk about hybrid, what I think about is how we start with the idea and we keep following the idea until it finds its form. And that for us is really important, because you have to get very certain and comfortable with uncertainty. And you have to kind of find other things around it that give you the stability that you need in order to just keep rolling with the idea and going it until one day we think this might be it, it's found its form. And I think part of the reason why I don't work in a museum or a gallery, not that I love those spaces, I love going to those exhibitions, but there's a kind of certainty already there. There's a space, things need to be put in there, those works already exist, there's a sort of bringing together of components, whereas in this scenario, it starts with just talking about the ideas that we love. And so that hybridity comes out of there being no prescription at the beginning for what it should be.
I'm just going to bounce off what you guys were saying too. I think this notion of, this is an example I use all the time when I work with dance students or teaching, is because it's really important for me to bring complexity on stage and ask myself, what does complexity look like on stage? And the example I always give is, we look at a MacBook Pro, a laptop, it's such a complex object, like the operational intelligence of this object is so complex, but design has made it sleek. So we live in a world that has sort of masked the amount of complexity in which we actually operate, and design has sort of taken charge of making these spaces very smooth. And so I always give this example, and I think as a society, in some ways, through design, we have sort of, in some cases, have had we have a bit of a difficulty negotiating ourselves with complexity. It can feel overwhelming, and so for me as an artist, it's really important to put notions of complexity on stage as other aesthetic notions that we can get comfortable with. So anyways, what you were saying really made me think of, and sometimes I give that example to students, something very basic, but for us to be aware that the systems we're constantly interacting with are so much more complex than what they actually seem on the outside.
Which is also something that sort of neuroscientists say. There's a neuroscientist I really like called Donald Hoffman, and he talks about how in some ways you don't need to see the complexity of the world. If you stopped and looked at all the complex, if you understood everything on a molecular level, you'd have been eaten in the jungle a long time ago. You kind of almost don't need it. You just need the smooth top layer surface. It's a leaf, it's a tree, it's not going to run out of the forest and eat me, the moon's not going to fall out the sky. And so you've sort of rendered things, and his argument is that it's sort of evolutionary that we see the world the way that it is because we only need to know, is it friend or foe? And therefore some of that sleekness and design, it's almost inbuilt into us, where if we stopped and looked at everything and understood everything on a deep molecular level, we would have been toast a long time ago, basically.
Yes, for sure. But what I'm left with is a sense of the power of the arts, the creative realm, for generating ways for us to hold complexity. Because I don't know whether you've definitely had to work with public sector organizations.
I kind of love it.
Right? but where their processes and their values aren't always conducive to this, so we're having to collaborate and inspire. So I'm just left inspired by what we're able to hold space for and influence with this approach. So from that to the body, because the body takes center stage in Bogota. It really centers specifically the body of labor. Humble, repetitive, marginalized, and it treats that body of labor as sacred. So how do you choreograph its presence on stage? Yeah, for those who haven't seen it, get a bit of an insight, but makes sense for those who've seen it already.
I think one of the things that fascinates me is what is in the margins. And looking at how do we value the margins and not, the peripheries, let's call it, what is in the periphery and not just what is in the center. So, you know, whether that's in a city, whether that's at a global scale, a country, you know, there's countries that live at the center, Occidental countries, the West, that are sort of these countries that operate in the center, and then you have all these countries at the peripheries. And so it's, for me, really important to ask this question on stage of how do we bring the bodies of the periphery to the center. And we'd also do this sort of at first, maybe before I get to the body, we do this in the scenic landscape. So what was really important for me in Bogota, but in a lot of our works, is we sort of shed the theater bare of its sort of theatricality. And I really try to create works that, ideas, bodies, humans that live in the peripheries, so that we value the periphery. A lot of the times when we see a dance work, mostly what's happening is in the center of the stage. And you know, it's really simple, but it's just like trying to you occupy the stage in ways where we get used to as audience members to also value the person that's in the corner at the back, in the periphery of that space, and not just what's happening at the center. So trying to sort of rebalance the relationship between periphery and center. And that brings me to this notion of the body of labor, which is something that I think has fascinated me. I think, you know, of my grandfather, very humble body from, you know, humble human, humble body from the land. We would call these people campesinos, people that sort of are born and work through the land. And I think in the world we have many bodies that exist in the periphery, and these bodies are the sort of many bodies that labor the world. So whether it's bodies that work in agriculture, in industry, all these bodies that labor the centers, these big, you know, cities like London or, you know, New York, there's so many people that operate, that are bodies of labor that help fuel and operate these centers. And I think in dance often we value a certain aesthetic, and it's really important for me to bring the body of labor, which is the sort of body of more marginalized communities, on stage as a way to make these bodies sacred, as a way to look at this language of repetition or effort or vulnerability in a certain efforted sense, to call that sacred on stage is really important for me. So that's sort of where that body of labor comes from, is looking at the relationship between the center and the periphery, in terms of cultures and communities and people.
But how do you choreograph its presence?
Choreograph
its presence. Yeah.
I mean, what the dancers are doing is real. It's difficult. It's not easy. You can't pretend. They're pushing scaffolds. They're pulling each other with harnesses. I try to unmask the artificiality of the stage, and they also are very much proponent of this because they generate a lot of this material with me rather than me impose. But a lot of what they're doing is negotiating things in real time and being in situations that are difficult, where they actually have to figure something out, figure out how do I get up and down this scaffold every time, because I can't just smooth the body. I actually have to negotiate this object, this effort, this person, this body that I'm dragging from my waist, is trying to put bodies in situations that feel as honest as possible in real time.
Presence it in a way I've never seen before. And so for our other panelists, we don't deal with choreography and bodies, but how do we think about bringing bodies or gestures that are usually excluded from public spaces into the center with care and visibility? Whether that's in terms of planning space, or
I mean,
public art programs.
when we're, we always look. I'll start by saying that when we're doing our projects, they're rarely in public spaces that are outside spaces. So they're often in public spaces that are indoor spaces. And I always make that distinction because lots of people think, when they think of the term public art, which is, I think, a term I've slowly come to loathe over time, because I think they immediately assume that I put sculpture in a square, and I don't. We find sites that resonate with the ideas that the artist is looking to work with, and then we have to work with the sort of complexity of that site. And I think how we bring people in, it's both physical access in terms of, if we're working with historical sites, sometimes they're not particularly accessible. In fact, they're rarely accessible, I would say. Then I would say that how do you bring them in from a psychological perspective where they feel it's not for them? So you're dealing with perception as much as you're dealing with physical barriers. And we talk about it a lot, a bit like you said with your team. We talk a lot in the office. There's a lot of discussion that happens around that point by which we open the doors and say the project is open. There's just thousands of hours that have gone into the conversations around how we're going to either demystify or signpost or wayfinding, all of this language that I know you'll be used to in architecture. But then on top of that, it's how do you also convince people to go on a journey with you to a part of a city or into a building that they've not been to before? And so that's also about the sort of, I suppose if we're talking about choreography, it's the messaging we're putting out there from the very beginning. That first moment that somebody reads about a project that we've got coming up is the moment where they either decide I want to know more or they shut off. And so how do we, and I suppose language is a big part of that as well, imagery, how do, all of these things, they form part of your first invitation, I guess. And so I would say for us, it's all of those things considered simultaneously as we're devising what we're going to be presenting.
There's so many things you say that,
yes.
that I want to react to this. So I don't know, it's all kind of mixed up now in my head, but I'm just going to answer. Architecture, I think, is a very disembodied profession in some ways, I would say. If performance, or if you're a jewelry designer, you produce the thing and it's there and you see it and it's direct. That interaction is very direct. With architecture, you always work through representation. Once it takes years for that thing to arrive, therefore you always operate in an abstract space that's often behind a computer, and you make decisions of a distance with a lot of assumptions. So what we try to, and often I think you put yourself into a position where you think the building can solve all the issues that you encounter. I design it out. I design it in. I design it so it's, once the building is there, it solves all the problems. And also you become dependent on a certain kind of client relationship. So all this is quite a big constraint, I feel. So what we've been trying to do is somehow develop a situated approach to this, where we are placing ourselves quite actively in the field to kind of change the process of how we start to get to know a site, how do we imagine a site in a kind of collaborative way by doing things. So events become important, another way of commissioning becomes important. But you get an embodied understanding of the site, of what you want to do. So that embodiment is quite important, that you kind of understand how it feels as much, not only assume. That's one reaction to it. And I think by doing that, you automatically develop a practice of advocacy, I feel. Because you take yourself out of that delivery role for a client. And you have to think differently about project funding, how projects are set up. So the design part starts very early. And I see it in a lot of our collaborators, colleagues, students, that this advocacy is a real driver, that you want to do good for your community, and by extension also that empathy extends to other communities. So for me, that situated approach of learning, of kind of working in and through architecture seems very crucial in producing more equitable spaces, I would say. I don't know if that made sense, but...
Perfect sense, yeah, really clear. That's how you bring the body into it. That's how you bring the body into the practice, by situating yourself conceptually, you know, in the project and the possibility of it. So we can't not attend to the fact that you are a designer, Andrea. And so I'm interested to find out how the material world influenced your approach to choreography. So you mentioned the improvisational approach that you took with the scaffolds, the piñatas, the flag, and letting the work emerge slowly. I'd like to know how the objects shaped the choreography rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I think with BOGOTÁ, we started that process really as I was finishing my master's. So definitely what I did in my master's, and kind of we sort of started this conversation with Andreas, but I find that choreography is a practice that sometimes just stays within its own universe, but it's actually not just a practice, it's a type of knowing. Choreography is a knowledge of the body, and so in my master's I was really fascinated with how do I observe design through a choreographic lens. So what I did was I applied, you know, parameters of choreography like our relationship to time, our relationship to repetition. In choreography we have things like negative space, you kind of interact with people's negative space. I don't remember the rest, but there were 5 sort of choreographic parameters that I applied to analyze a design situation, whether it was an object or a building, to kind of apply choreographic thinking into material world. And then that really, I think, influenced what kind of work we made with BOGOTÁ. And so my curiosity was rather looking at the relationship of body and object right away. So we started, you know, we brought a ton of objects, and it was how do we interact with an object outside of how we know, you know, so how to not just sit in a chair, but how to explore like the materiality of this object, how to be in a conversation between the human and the non-human. We live in such an anthropocentric world where like it's so human-centered. And in our indigenous mythology and the mythology of the Muisca people, our belief is that, well, their belief very many years ago is that sort of the materiality asks for what it wants to become. So the craftsperson that shapes the piece of wood, or the craftsperson that will shape the clay, is sort of in a practice of listening to what the object wants to become, and that object in its process of becoming has a spirit. So it's a very, you know, the human and the non-human are just 2 agents trying to have a conversation. So in my way of doing that is just to sort of we brought in all these objects, industrial metal, pieces of scaffold, chairs, like harnesses, just to see what was the conversation of body and object, and explore not just what the body can do with the object, but also what the object offers to the body, and how do we build this sort of meeting place. So yeah, it was really trying to level, I think, the human and non-human. I usually say I don't call scenography, I call it more of a, oh my God, I forgot. I call it a landscape of possibility.
Just let that drift over you. Unfortunately, we don't have time to offer that, your reflections on that, to the rest of the panel because we want to make time for the audience to offer some questions as well. But thank you so much for that really generative and inspirational conversation. You could go on, I'm sure. But for now, it's over to you guys. Who's got a question?
I wonder if the panel could talk a little bit more about the relationship between the smoothness of the iMac and our need for that smoothness and the contradictory need for complexity, the billions of decisions that are rendered easy by the smoothness.
Do you mind? There is an incredible philosopher, and I really feel so bad I'm not going to pronounce this well because it's not that clear in my head, but I think it's Byung Chang. He's a Korean philosopher, and he has a book that's called Smooth Beauty. And it's fascinating, fabulous. It's about how our society is obsessed with the smooth. And he takes the example of Jeff Koons' balloon, like big balloon animals, and how when people, go to a museum to see this art object, they're so enthralled by this art object because of its smoothness. And because of that smooth beauty, they even see themselves reflected against this metal. So there's, we see ourselves inside of this beautiful object. But he really sort of does this beautiful critique about how how do we pull away from the notion of smoothness? Because we see it on Instagram, filters, like our first proposition, you take a selfie is to swipe so that your skin looks smooth. So we have this fascination with the notion of smooth beauty. I really recommend this book, and it's how do we challenge ourselves to go outside of that smooth beauty. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce his name right, but
I always think about smoothness into it. Actually, funny, it's architecture related. It's two things. One is I'm sort of slightly obsessed with those old Victorian houses. They tend to be in like really expensive parts of London that look like big white wedding cakes. Do you know what I mean? And I've always looked at them and thought, oh wow, that looks like a huge wedding cake. And then one day it dawned on me that it was like the way they've smoothed the plaster on it and done like a load of, I don't know, decorative edges all the way around it. They tend to be in like West London, those big houses. You know what I mean? And one day it dawned on me that actually there's skill that's covering labour, because you don't see the brickwork, but you see this like smooth skill that covers it, right? And then I remember the first time I saw the Shard, I was like, wow, look how smooth it is. And but what really struck me about it was that I could see its surface, but I couldn't really go in any further. And so it was like there was a skin deep sort of boundary or something where I was invited to look in, but I couldn't actually go in. I mean, you can pay to go in or whatever. But yeah, there's two things. That smoothness question comes to me when I think of those two types of architectures.
Okay. I really enjoyed the conversation with dialogue and the materials, and it's maybe a stupid anecdote, but we always had really bad cars, and I would always pick my kids up in a really car from school that didn't start, made weird noise. We would sit outside the school with all their mates, and it goes, and it didn't start, and then smelled funny. And nothing ever worked, the windows don't get the radio, so we bought a new car at one point, and everything worked. And somehow there is a kind of memory attached to the other car that feels like a dialogue, that is quite a fondness. They got over the embarrassment of being the kids outside with the weird car, but there is a kind of memory attached to it. I feel that is the dialogue, and I think that this summer I rented a really nice new Chinese car where everything works. There is it kind of erasure, like that kind of dialogue with that object that creates a kind of memory in the moment of time or spirit that seems to get buried in some ways, I feel, denied, or I always like when I see stickers on an iMac. Like, I don't know, when people personalize it or when scratched or bumped, I always go, ooh, but actually it's a way of personalizing it. And yeah, so smoothness, what was the other part? Smoothness and complexity. Yeah, complexity, I feel, is now extremely important to bring nuance into conversations, probably more than ever. So how we do that through objects would be quite interesting. But I mean, there's a really obvious need for nuance and complexity. Yeah.
I just wanted to make an offer about that. And I think that there's a lot of different cultures in our society, whether it's a corporate culture or other cultures, that actually do have a tolerance for complexity. But I think, for me, what seems to be unique about art making is when we were talking about liminality. And I think maybe the word that we could introduce into that discourse is ambiguity. Because I think it's one of the things we offer to the audience. And I think it's one of the things, I was so excited to hear you talk about your work and face so bravely the uncertainty of what you're walking into the space to create. And yet at the same time, you, because of the complex system you studied within, you are also creating landmarks for yourself in order to cope with that. But it seems to me that it's the tolerance for ambiguity that might set you apart and might bridge the concepts of smoothness and complexity.
Thank you.
It also occurs to me that smoothness equals safety for some people, as opposed to, like you're saying, what's the surprise or the learning or the traction that roughness or something unexpected may offer you. And I think it's a false equivocation.
Hi, my name is Tante. Thank you very much for all the contributions so far. I picked up on very well the idea of some of the indigenous practices that you're drawing from. I've just finished my master's in diasporic dance styles, and so I've been digging very much into my own culture and how that facilitates my work and so on and so forth. So I'm really interested in hearing from each of the panel members which parts of your indigenous practice, whether it's yours or one that you're very interested in, plays a part in your work and how.
Do you want me to start?
I'll kick off if that's
Sure.
okay.
Yeah.
But I can quickly go. I'll be very quick. I'll just say, as a curator, my impulse is to honor my ancestry, honor my history, honor the complexity of everything I've inherited and what I represent. So I'm sure that's kind of what's influencing you in your studies and what you'll make going forward. So it's about intentional conversation with the past and being open to learning across that plane of inquiry.
Yeah, I think for me it's a mix. I would say there's things that are quite tangible, like in some of the works in Bogotá, but mostly in other works. I'll teach my team a dance that comes from like my grandfather's region, and we learn the footwork, we learn the steps, we learn the takati, like the song. So that's like really tangible and really concrete, something that we're trying to pass on, or through texts that we read together, mythologies from my culture that I try to bring to the team as actual knowledge that then they embody. In the piece, there's a section called Precolombinos, and in Colombia, we had a lot of gold, and so the indigenous people would make these sort of really small figurines made of gold, and they're these crazy, they're incredibly graphic shaped beings made of gold, and so the dancers would study them and sort of try to find choreographic gestures that would replicate these graphic shapes that they would see. So those are really tangible ways, concrete ways. And then I think in terms of other ways is also in the sense of honoring the ancestry, is thinking what are the values of my people and how do I operate and hold a space with those values. So things like decentering, things like, human and non-human, things like decentering my role as a choreographer as well, sort of what values of, that have been passed on to me from my grandfather can I bring into the space as practices in ways of how we work, how we create. So it's a bit, that's the more intangible side, but it's more in the sort of how to work with people. Yeah.
I think similarly, I think the intangible that you mentioned at the end, I grew up in Pakistan and my father is Pakistani and my mother is English, and so you grow up in these in a slightly sort of split cultural context where you've got two different influences happening at the same time, and having spent the first sort of 12 years of my life there, I'm definitely been formed in a culture that's very different to what is here, and as a result of that, coming here then was able to maybe witness or see a kind of way in which the sort of social and political landscape operates in terms of who gets to be acknowledged and recognized and who doesn't, and that's not to say that it only happened here, it also happened there as well, like people can be quite selective of whether you're one of them or not, depending on, so I don't think either side is necessarily beyond a kind of critique of how they treat something that they don't see as entirely their own. But at the same time, I think what I think that made me sensitive to is the idea that actually it's quite easy to overlook people, and it's quite easy for people to maybe find themselves in a scenario where they don't necessarily feel seen or heard in some way. So how do you then work with that knowledge, but not necessarily, I'm not trying to fix all those problems, but I'm maybe just a bit sensitive to them. So the artists that we work with, or the ideas that we're working with I'm always quite often thinking about, like, has this person been given an opportunity in another scenario, and is the idea that they're bringing forward one that feels challenging because a lot more mediation and negotiation is going to need to happen to get it out there. And I think that's where maybe some of my own experience informs my sometimes desire to want to support that work. But I don't necessarily go out looking for that, but I become sensitive to it when it comes my way, and I go, oh, I've got a way of reading this that feels familiar.
So I've lived in the UK longer than I've lived in Germany, but the German accent is very stubborn. So whenever I walk into the room, I'm still German. If I go to Bulgaria, where we often go, I'm the English person in the village.
I'm the English person in Pakistan, and I'm the Pakistani person here, so it's fine.
But one thing I noticed is I think there's a different aesthetic sense being German or being English. And one I noticed, in England you argue a lot through history. There's always, with the design, it has a reference to something historical. The UK didn't have a revolution, it still has a monarchy, etc. Germany had 2 wars, you had to make an active break with the past, and therefore the aesthetic sense is very different. You don't refer to the past, you maybe disrupt that continuously. So where often in the UK my colleagues look for that kind of synthesis and synergy and kind of harmony with the past, I feel often the expression is very kind of anti that comes out. So my aesthetic expression often isn't recognized here. And I find that it took me a while to get my head around and feel comfortable with that. So I like things people look at and think this is a bit rubbish. And I think that's quite interesting.
Same.
Yeah, same, yeah. But yeah, so I don't know, that's more maybe identity than indigeneity. Yeah, I haven't really dug deeper into, I did an ancestry test and I'm 90% German from a specific region, but there was hope that I'm more multicultural, but I'm very German. And I don't know that place where I'm come from. So I guess there's a lingering thought, maybe I should, start there or go back there. But we've done, in CSM, where I teach, we've done a lot of work with indigenous groups in Colombia, or maybe with people that translate, that work a lot with indigenous groups in Colombia. And what I feel is that there's a real kind of a question of belonging that moves into the conversation around the architecture. So how do you construct an architecture of belonging? And I feel that's one thing that I really made me think, engaging with these practices of the rituals, of the cosmologies, of the ways of understanding the body as a first territory and moving from there, which all speak to me about the rootedness and belonging to a place and a time. And we don't have that approach in architecture in the UK. So I feel there's a real curiosity about that. And maybe that is transversal to a lot of other indigenous practices, I would say. But I'm not an expert, I'm an explorer, I would say.
Well, that's a really interesting note for us to end our very amazing conversation on. And what's left is for me to just thank you once again for being so receptive and open and generous with your answers. So thank you, Andreas Lang, Mariam Zulfiqar, and Andrea Peña. It's been an amazing conversation. Thank you, audience, as well, for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you.